So, spoilers for Barry.
Oh, wow.
Barry is the story of a Marine turned hitman trying to become an actor. Starting off fairly similar to other various anti-hero shows, while the first season of Barry plays with the idea of Barry being an anti-hero we could sympathize with and has the potential for redemption, similar to Walter White or Dexter, it quickly reveals that Barry is ultimately the villain of the show, who is a quick-tempered, unstable, violent individual and ends up being a criticism of storytelling devices that lead to power fantasies found in most anti-hero shows. In short, Barry is more like Venture Bros than Rick and Morty. A way this show does this is by having season 2 and onwards no longer be just about Barry, but it's an ensemble cast of people whose lives Barry ends up making so much worse. His family friend and the man who brought Barry into the criminal underworld, Fuchs, the egocentric acting coach and the man Barry has decided to be his father figure, Gene Cousineau, judge and criminal and mostly harmless stereotype NoHo Hank, and of course, Sally is Barry's girlfriend who he first meets outside of Gene's acting class, and is one of the reasons Barry got into acting. From season 1, we learned that Sally is a self-centered, egocentric, temperamental woman. And Barry is a murderer. Since the start of season 2 and all the way to the very end, fan interpretations around Sally have been very strange. Sally is not hated by a subgroup of the fandom the way Skylar White from Breaking Bad was hated. Rather, people seem to think Sally is just as bad, if not worse, than Barry, and the show's true villain, with her last scene either proving how corrupt or broken she is. And the thing is, these people are wrong. And I don't mean in a subjective, open to interpretation manner. I mean as it would literally go against the themes and intention of what Bill Hader and the writers of Barry intended. In several interviews, Bill Hader has expressed his general frustration with the perception some people had of Barry and Sally. Due to her narcissism, people thought Sally was the real villain of the show, despite the fact that Barry is a violent murderer who acts like a child. While an incredibly flawed person I would hate in real life, the idea that she is just as bad as Barry or ends up broken at the end would completely contradict with what the story is saying. I would like to address the main hate against Sally. A lot of Sally's relationships, especially in the first 2 seasons, are tied to men and the power they have over her in a relationship. Her acting coach Gene verbally berates her in order to get a bad performance out of her. Her first agent was only representing her in order to sleep with her, and once she rejects his advances, he quickly ditches her. But the relationship that defines Sally the most is with her first husband, Sam. Married right out of high school, Sally was stuck in a physically abusive relationship, and when we first learned the story, she presents it in a scene for class as her defining moment of triumph, where she stood up to Sam and left him. However, we soon learned that this is not true. Sally stayed with Sam for years, only gained the courage to leave one night in his sleep where her friend took her to a women's shelter before she moved to LA to try and be an actress.
I, I mean, I think I curled into bed with him afterwards, and I think that I held him.
Sally's relationship with Barry is essentially the first relationship where she had the majority of the power, at first. Now I want to get this point out of the way first because I know I'll get this comment. Yes, Sally is not a great person, and is not a great girlfriend to Barry. She is egocentric, volatile, and is constantly looking for approval while also incredibly quick to put others down. In short, Sally is the worst kind of theater kid. If I knew Sally in real life, I wouldn't like her, but with the context of what's around her, I understand why she turned out the way she did. A lot of characters draw parallels with Barry throughout the show, with Sally possibly being the most notable. In Season 2, she mirrors how Barry lies to himself. In Season 3, she mirrors Barry's deep, intense rage. However, just because she resembles Barry at her worst, it doesn't mean her actions are nearly as bad. If they're both aggressive canines, Barry is a coyote, while Sally is an undisciplined corgi yapping at your heels. One is a nuisance, the other one is dangerous. In Season 2, when it comes to her defiant scene, Sally originally rewrites the scene for her class as an honest portrayal of what she went through, and it's a powerful harrowing scene that receives critical praise from her agent. But when it's time to perform in front of an audience of hundreds, Sally goes for the far easier, ideal fantasy of what happened. Not only does it end up getting her praise from the public, but ends up getting her own temporary show, but most of all, Sally is able to portray herself as a conventionally strong person in a feel-good narrative. Barry lies to himself throughout the show in a very different way. Initially lying to himself that he's a good person and that the people he kill are bad people who deserve to be killed, he continues to spiral into worse and worse behavior, only to tell himself that he can earn redemption without giving up what he wants. When Barry tells the class about the first time he took a life, he lets the class believe that he doing so crushed his spirit, when in reality, Barry received praise from his fellow Marines and how it ended up being the best day of his life.
That how it happened?
Barry Berman!
Barry?
Barry Berman!
Barry. Is that what really happened? Yeah.
But Barry refuses to acknowledge that he is responsible for his actions and will often find an excuse for himself. Barry yelling at Sally and then Sally yelling at Natalie are some of the most intense scenes in the shows, and it's viewed by the fandom as these characters' lowest moments. However, they also view them as being equally as bad, when doing so has to remove a ton of context as to why each had their outburst. When Barry yells at Sally, it's because Gene found out Barry killed his girlfriend and threatened to turn him in. Now in Barry's warped mind, he believes that if he gets Gene's apart, it will make up for killing his girlfriend. But when Barry doesn't get his way and Sally doesn't let Gene on her show, he shows his true colors and deteriorates into a violent person again. After Barry yells at Sally, not only is she visibly scared, but she reverts back to how she comforted Sam after he physically abused her, preparing Barry his dinner before he came home with the donut he obviously likes, and even buying Barry a replacement controller for his video game, and ends up apologizing for him like she did with Sam before. Which is why it boggles me when people claim that Sally yelling at Natalie is just as bad, or even worse than when Barry yelled at Sally. Yes, Sally's freak out Natalie was bad, but very few people consider the scene from Sally's perspective. Sally told a deeply personal story about her abusive husband and the trauma she dealt. She dealt with bad agents and bad jobs and was the head showrunner of her own show. Then it got canceled because it wasn't matching the algorithm. And then Natalie creates a near identical show with none of the background, solely made to appeal to the algorithm. And if I can go on a bit of a tangent, people seem to really infantilize Natalie as Sally's abused, innocent assistant. For one, while Sally was not a great boss to Natalie was not working for Sally. She was a fellow actor in Sally's acting class who kind of forced herself into Sally's work, and Sally let her tag along, not only in the making of her show, but along with the red carpet premiere. While people get really hung up on the fact that Sally made Natalie cut her carrots and be quiet during meetings, people don't really seem to mention that Natalie was being far more callous to her assistant than Sally ever was to Natalie.
Make me an appointment at the acupuncturist where Chloe Grace Moretz gets hers done, but make sure that it's with the tattoo guy and not the bangs girl, because I did not like her. Ding ding! Oof, I'm hungry. But not for any of that stuff.
So Sally, after having the best experience of her life stolen from her, ends up seeing Natalie in the showrunner's room, while at her most emotionally vulnerable, and ends up freaking out.
So you stole my show.
No, it's actually a really important story to me.
It's not a story. It's a fucking math equation. Nobody's ever put a hand around your fucking neck. This was my story. My story.
I don't think what Sally did was right, but it's something I totally understand why she would do that. But you know who does think Sally was in the right? Bill Hader.
If you're pushed far enough, and if you love something enough, can you be violent? Can it push you to violence? And I think Sally is a victim of abuse. She's had violence perpetrated on her, and she's doing an artistic endeavor in order to deal with it and bring, a big audience to it and be able to talk openly about it. And she did everything right, and the show was great. And then an algorithm buried it. Game. And then she sees Natalie. And it's just like, this game has no rules. Mm-hmm. This game has 0 rules. Fuck this. Like, fuck all of you guys. And I think that is a perfectly... I think she's totally in her right to feel as she does in that episode.
Hey, that was so wonderful, Miss Reed.
Oh, thank you guys. Thanks for coming.
I want to talk about Sally's ending and how people kind of have a bad faith interpretation of the ending. After Barry escapes from prison and Sally gets essentially blacklisted from acting, the two go on a run and start a family living on the lam for nearly a decade. During this time, Sally is miserable. She's at her absolute lowest. She's barely able to get through the day and is constantly drunk. All while she lies to her son every day of who she is. However, after she gets kidnapped by NoHo Hank and thinks she might die, she's finally truthful to her son. She's truthful about herself, and she's truthful about Barry. And she and John leave Barry, knowing the life she had with him was a lie. Years after Barry's death, Sally rebuilds her life as an acting teacher to a public high school. Some fans interpret Sally as being broken by the end, that she is still the same validation-seeking monster she once was, because she really wanted her son's opinion on what he thought of her play, and while a part of her may still seek validation, it's diminished greatly by now. I know this because when the man asked Sally if she wanted to go get coffee sometime later, Sally simply says no.
Hey, do you want to go get a drink or maybe a cup of coffee or something?
No.
She didn't dance over eggshells or try to make an excuse. Sally simply told the man who praised her play that she just wasn't interested. There's somewhat of a meta-irony in talking about how the fandom views Sally, compared to how they view Barry the character. Throughout the show, Barry's had somewhat of a commentary on US military culture and how it's treated by the public. How despite being a flawed institute, people are expected to treat the people in there with respect and sympathy. Which is why Barry, a violent mass murderer, will be remembered as a sympathetic hero, opposed to Jean, who will now be remembered in a far less sympathetic light, despite just kind of being a jackass. Despite Barry's flaws, most of the fandom is able to sympathize with him because we see him at his most vulnerable. Meanwhile, much of the fandom hates Sally, not because she's a violent murderer, but because she's annoying. So, I know this isn't usually the kind of video I make. This was meant to be made in October, but then my computer crashed, and I had to go get it fixed. If you want to hear more talk about Barry, I did a podcast with Macabre Storytelling in the afternoon tune about it, as well as other problematic protagonists. If you want an update on animation, Howling Hoods is still in development, and we are still working on our Myths of Manhattan pilot. If you want to see something like this again, like some kind of semi-rant video essay, let me know in the comments. I might do it. Until then, peace and love.